now appear again with Ruth Brander, and I'm representing John Burke-Monerville, Patricia Armani de Silva, and Marc Wadsworth, who are each core participants in the category of justice campaigns, and their solicitors are Bernberg Pierce. In this opening statement, I'm going to explain who my clients are and outline what they're seeking from the inquiry, and also set out their concerns about its ability to get to the truth. All three were involved in campaigns seeking answers and justice in respect of police violence, racism, and corruption. All three have reason to believe that they or their campaigns were subjected to undercover policing. They haven't been given any satisfactory explanation why or how, or for what length of time they were spied on, who authorised it, or how the information gathered has been or was intended to be used. They, like others from whom you've already heard, are very concerned about the number of justice campaigns who was similarly reported on by the SDS, and they're deeply sceptical about the explanation offered by the MPS to date that these groups were merely collateral intrusion, accidentally hoovered up in information gathered about other more dangerous groups. Mr. Burke-Monerville, Ms. Armani de Silva and Mr. Wadsworth want answers in relation to their own cases, but they also want the inquiry to confront the patterns that emerge from the repeated reporting on justice campaigns and the issues of institutional, structural, and individual racism that underpin them. It is really remarkable that the Metropolitan Police, in their opening submissions, made absolutely no mention of the issue of racism being a critical one for this inquiry to address. As I will detail later, Ms. Armani de Silva, in particular, as part of the Justice for John Charles de Menezes campaign, has first-hand experience of the critical significance of information and misinformation in shaping the public narrative about police action. Given the clear benefit to the police of having information with which to undermine groups who are campaigning against police violence, against racism or corruption in the police, the inquiry is asked to scrutinise very carefully and with a penetrating, sceptical gaze the purported explanation advanced by the Metropolitan Police for undercover reporting on justice campaigns. And the inquiry is urged to examine the use to which any information gathered was or might have been put, and to assess the role that racism, both individual and institutional, played in the undercover policing of justice campaigns. And the chair is also asked to reflect and address his own unconscious biases. I'm going to tell you about each of my clients. Mr. John Burke-Monerville is now 77 years old. He moved to England as a young teenager, where he attended St. Bernard's Boys Catholic School in Whitechapel. He was the only black child apart from one Asian boy, and unsurprisingly, it was very hard. He left school at 17 and began to work. At 25, he went to evening classes to study electronics, and then he went on to Waltham Forest College to study more electronics and maths. He successfully completed college, and he then went on to an apprenticeship in Goldsmith Row, where he repaired electronic goods. It was hard work. It included evenings and weekends. The day he finished, he borrowed money from his father and he took over J&S TV shop in London E9 upon the retirement of the previous owner. And he ran that shop for 30 years, becoming very well known in the community, both because of his shop, but also for his love of music, because Mr. Burke-Monerville has always sung ballads and soul music. He's always worked hard and cared for his family. And now he should be enjoying his retirement with his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and indeed his great-grandchildren. But instead, he finds himself in a public inquiry fighting to discover why he and his family were spied upon by the police. On New Year's Eve, 1986, one of his sons, Trevor, who was then aged 19, was out with two of John's sisters when he disappeared from outside a nightclub in Stoke Newington, London. He was arrested, and the following day he was found semi-conscious in an unknown car, and he was then arrested again on suspicion of criminal damage in respect of the car he was found in, and he was taken to Stoke Newington Police Station. While he was there, Mr. Burke-Monerville attended searching for him, and he was told falsely by the police that Trevor wasn't there. In the early hours of the 2nd of January, Trevor was taken by police to the A&E department of Homerton Hospital. He was returned to the police station shortly afterwards, and at some point that day, he was restrained by 6 officers in order that his fingerprints could be taken by force. He was then taken back to Homerton Hospital at about 10 p.m. and again discharged back to Stoke Newington Police Station at midnight. The following day, he was remanded from the Magistrates' Court to Brixton Prison, and it's understood that he was so unwell that he couldn't be brought into court, so the magistrate had to go to the cell to remand him. When the family visited him in Brixton, he was plainly very unwell, and on the 4th of January he suffered fits. On the 6th of January, he was transferred to the Maudsley Hospital for an emergency operation on his brain, requiring the removal of a blood clot. On that day, the Crown Prosecution Service dropped all charges against him. The family and the local community began a campaign to discover what had happened to Trevor between his disappearance on the 31st of December 1986 and his admission to the Maudsley Hospital 6 days later. Trevor never recovered his memory of what had happened to him. Doctors at the Maudsley had advised the family that his memory was likely to return one day, but it hadn't done so by the time he was murdered on the streets near his family home in March 1994. He was stabbed 15 times as he was making his way home from a friend's house. No one has ever been brought to justice in connection with his murder. During the lifetime of the Justice for Trevor Monerville campaign, both Trevor and other members of the Monerville family, including Mr. Burke-Monerville's then 79-year-old father and 73-year-old mother, were subjected to harassment by the police. In 1991, Mr. Burke-Monerville's mother was arrested, and she was then prosecuted for allegedly assaulting a police officer. She was acquitted at trial and then brought a successful action against the Metropolitan Police for malicious prosecution. Trevor found the harassment by the MPS so bad that for a few years he moved to St. Lucia in order to escape it, but he had to return when his epilepsy, a condition he had developed following his brain surgery, worsened. In February 2013, another of Mr. Burke-Monerville's sons, Joseph, was shot and killed on the streets of Hackney. This was by a suspected gang member. Joseph, when killed, was parked in a car with his twin brother Jonathan and their older brother David. David was also injured in the shooting. The police quickly accepted that Joseph had been mistaken for a member of a local gang, and they confirmed that neither Joseph nor any of the family has any connection with gangs. In fact, at the time of this incident, Joseph and his twin brother Jonathan were studying crime scene and forensic science at the Metropolitan University in London. 3 individuals were due to stand trial in respect of Joseph's murder, but the prosecution was dropped days before the trial. An investigation conducted following the family's complaint about the police's handling of the criminal investigation concluded that there had been a number of failings, and to date, no one has been brought to justice for Joseph's murder. Tragically, on the 19th of June, a third son, David, was fatally stabbed outside his home in North London. 3 men have been charged not with murder, but with aggravated burglary in connection with his death. The trial was due to commence in March of 2020, but when COVID descended, it had to be adjourned. In 2014, while Mr. Burke-Monerville was still grieving at the death of his son, Joseph, he was contacted by Operation Hearn and informed that they had information for him. In 2016, he was told that the Justice for Trevor Monerville campaign had been listed in the 1987 SDS annual report as one of the organisations that was directly penetrated or closely monitored during the year under review. He was granted core participant status in the inquiry on the 11th of February of 2016. However, nearly 5 years on, and despite his commitment to participating in the inquiry and his participation as a claimant in 2 judicial review cases challenging the inquiry process, he has not received any further information as to how or why the campaign to seek justice for his son was subject to undercover policing. Like so many others, he has a profound need to discover the truth. He states, "I feel a responsibility to my sons, myself, my family, and my community to ensure that this inquiry comes through with some sort of answers about why we were spied on by the police. We've not been told the truth by anybody in authority about anything all along. I have no reason to be hopeful about this inquiry. No one in authority has given me that, but I do remain hopeful. It is, though, my last hope, and I'm tired. I don't want my surviving children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to go through what we are going through." Ms. Armani de Silva is the first cousin of Jean Charles de Menezes. John Charles is the Brazilian man who was shot and killed by police at Stockwell Underground Station on the 22nd of July of 2005, when he was mistaken for a suicide bomber. Ms. Armani de Silva has been involved in the Jean Charles de Menezes family campaign ever since his death. At the time of the shooting, she had been sharing a flat with John Charles, together with another cousin, and she learnt of his death when she was asked to attend Brixton Police Station on the day of the shooting. The initial reporting, including by then Commissioner Sir Ian Blair, suggested that Jean Charles had run through the ticket barrier, that he was wearing suspicious clothing, and that he failed to stop when asked to do so. This gave the impression that Jean Charles was not an entirely innocent victim and appeared to mitigate the enormity of the police error. This was greatly distressing to Jean Charles' family because they knew it was highly unlikely he would have done anything wrong. It subsequently transpired that all of the early assertions about Jean Charles' behaviour were false. He hadn't run from the police, he had not failed to respond to a command, and he wasn't wearing suspicious clothing. Although the subsequent investigation by the then Independent Police Complaints Commission into how the misinformation came to be put into the public domain concluded that there was no evidence that the Commissioner or any other member of the Metropolitan Police Service had knowingly released or concurred in the release of false information, nonetheless, the IPCC concluded that once, and I quote, the MPS knew that Mr. de Menezes was innocent on the morning of the 23rd of July 2005, they should have refrained from publicly discussing the shooting until such time as the facts had been fully established. Whilst the MPS admitted to having made a tragic mistake, they continued to try to justify the shooting by referring to Mr. de Menezes' own actions and clothing. Despite subsequent widespread publication of the fact that the initial information about Jean Charles and his actions was false, the impression given in those first hours following the shooting remains, for many, the enduring narrative. And to this day, the family have to correct the false impression that Jean Charles in some way contributed to his own death. And nor was this the only occasion on which Jean Charles' family had cause for concern about information being put into the public domain. they believe by the police in order to discredit Jean-Charles and deflect from the police's own failings. On the 11th of March 2006, Harriet Wistrich, Ms. Armani de Silva's solicitor, received a telephone call from D.I. Paul Settle, informing her that an article was going to be published in the Sunday Mirror the following day, detailing a rape allegation that had been made against Jean-Charles by a woman who stated she recognised him from a photograph she had seen in the media. Miss Wistrich's clear recollection is that D.I. Settle gave the unambiguous impression that the article was as the result of a police leak. It was subsequently proved by DNA analysis that Jean-Charles was not the assailant. The matter was investigated by the Metropolitan Police's Directorate of Professional Standards under the supervision of the IPCC, and D.I. Settle denied having told Miss Wistrich that the information had been leaked from a police source. The journalist who had reported on the allegation refused to reveal his source, and the investigation into the leak concluded, in the light of the number of people who knew of the allegation, including those outside the MPS, that further investigation was unlikely to identify the source of the leak. So Ms. Armani de Silva cannot prove that the police deliberately put false information about Jean-Charles into the public domain on these or other occasions, for example, when it was reported that he was an illegal immigrant. Nor is she aware of anything to suggest that any of the false information that was published about him came from an undercover source. However, for Ms. Armani de Silva, there is a chilling parallel between her experiences of misinformation being put into the public domain about Jean-Charles and the account that Peter Francis has publicly given of SDS officers being tasked with infiltrating justice campaigns in order to source information with which to discredit them. This has always been denied by the MPS, but Ms. Armani de Silva asks the inquiry to seek out the evidence of those involved in the justice campaigns and consider whether there are common aspects of their experiences which call into question those denials. It may not be possible for any one campaign individually to prove that information put into the public domain about them or their loved one was part of a deliberate attempt by the MPS to smear them. But if this is a common experience across many campaigns, then defences of accidental error or denial of attribution on the part of the MPS become more difficult to sustain. Likewise, if such a pattern were to emerge, it calls into question the suggestion that the collection of information about these campaigns was merely overzealous, collateral recording by undercover officers targeted against other groups, even if, as Operation Hearn found, there is no evidence in the surviving documentation of explicit tasking, and I shall come on to the lack of evidence in a moment. Whilst isolated instances of misinformation about the victims of police misconduct may be explained as breakdowns in communication, multiple instances of information about justice campaigns being covertly obtained and recorded must raise questions over ulterior motive, particularly in light of the allegations made by Peter Francis. Ms. Armani de Silva learnt that information about the Jean-Charles de Menezes family campaign had been inappropriately gathered by the SDS when she and other members of the de Menezes family and their campaign were contacted by Operation Hearn in 2014. They were shown 5 redacted intelligence reports, and these recorded information about individuals connected with or meetings of the campaign, including references to political views expressed by relatives of Jean-Charles. Ms. Armani de Silva was told by Operation Hearn that she could submit a subject access request under the then Data Protection Act 1998 or a Freedom of Information Act request to the Metropolitan Police Service for further information. And when she did, the Metropolitan Police Service responded in February 2015, refusing to disclose any further details. despite seeking actively to participate in the inquiry since October 2015, and like Mr. Burke-Monerville in 2 judicial reviews of the process, she has not to date been provided with any further information as to how or why the campaign for justice for Jean-Charles de Menezes was subject to undercover police spying. Mr. Marc Wadsworth is a journalist, an author, a historian, and a campaigner. In 1991, he founded and led the Anti-Racist Alliance. The ARA was Europe's largest Black-led anti-racist movement, and it comprised faith groups, civil organisations, MPs from all the main parties and trade unions. It had branches throughout England, Scotland, and Wales, and had a high political and media profile. It was often seen by the police and other state bodies as a thorn in their side. In 1993, Mr. Wadsworth assisted the family of Stephen Lawrence to set up their campaign for justice, and he introduced them to the lawyer Imran Khan QC. Through his contacts in the African National Congress, Mr. Wadsworth facilitated a meeting between the Lawrence family and Nelson Mandela, and he also introduced the Lawrence family to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who, like Mr. Mandela, was a Nobel Prize winner. Mr. Wadsworth has also made DPA and FOI requests to the MPS for disclosure of information they hold on him. These requests, I don't know whether the inquiry can hear that. Those are foxes in my back garden. I do apologise. This is about the time when they come out. These requests have been followed by requests from his MP, Harriet Harman. However, all that has been disclosed to date is a redacted document that appears to be an intelligence report dated the 2nd of May 1996 concerning a planned ARA march in central London, and a report dated the 27th of May 1999 relating to a complaint made by Mr. Wadsworth to the police in respect of a threatening letter he had received. The MPS has refused to either confirm or deny whether the ARA or its members were subjected to surveillance. Mr. Wadsworth was granted core participant status on the 21st of October of 2015. As with Mr. Burke-Monerville and Miss Armani de Silva, no further information has been disclosed to him as to whether, and if so how or why, he or the ARA were subject to undercover policing. All 3 of these core participants have an overwhelming need to know the truth, not just about how, why, and by whom they were spied upon, but about the deeper systemic truths about the SDS. They want to know the truth about Peter Francis' allegations of the targeting of justice campaigns, and they want the racism inherent in the view of justice campaigns as troublemakers to be recognised and addressed. In Mr. Burke-Monerville's case, he additionally has a very personal need for the truth about his sons. He appreciates that the inquiry's terms of reference are limited to the investigation of undercover policing, and therefore, on their face, do not extend to investigating the wider circumstances of the murders of his sons or the circumstances of Trevor's treatment in police custody. However, a core aspect of the inquiry's remit is to examine the motivation for and the scope of undercover police operations in practice and their effect upon individuals in particular and the public in general. The issue of racism as a motivation for some aspects of the SDS reporting and deployments must be at the heart of the inquiry's investigation, including in respect of the direct penetration or close monitoring of the Justice for Trevor Monerville campaign. That requires an investigation of the underlying circumstances of, at the very least, the treatment of Trevor by the police. At present, there are 2 possible motivations. The first, a desire to derail and discredit the campaign's attempts to bring to light racist police brutality and subsequent harassment. And that is what Mr. Burke-Monerville fears. Or, as the police have to date maintained, the targeting of extreme left-wing groups who are said to have infiltrated family justice campaigns, such as the Justice for Trevor campaign. It will be impossible for the inquiry to assess where the truth lies in respect of these two competing motivations without considering the underlying circumstances. And if it is right, as the family have always suspected from the fragments they've been able to piece together, that Trevor was restrained and assaulted during his time in police custody, then that and the fact that the police have never been open about their actions on that night must raise a real question about their motivations for subsequently infiltrating the campaign that was trying to bring that brutality to light. In other words, uncovering the underlying facts of what happened to Trevor is an essential part of testing the collateral intrusion narrative. The third Operation Hearn report identifies 17 Black justice campaigns that are mentioned in the SDS records between 1970 and 2005. The concerns raised about the police motivation for such repeated covert reporting on campaigns aimed at exposing police violence or misconduct are supported, as I've said, by the allegations made by Peter Francis. These were first aired in public by The Observer on the 14th of March 2010, when Mr. Francis alleged that the SDS had infiltrated Black justice campaigns and effectively thwarted their activities. He said this: "My presence in the groups made that justice harder to obtain. Once the SDS get into an organisation, it is effectively finished." And on the 4th of June of 2013, in an article in The Guardian, he alleged that his superiors had wanted him to find dirt that could be used to undermine public sympathy for the family of Stephen Lawrence and their criticism of police failings in connection with the murder investigation. And in a Channel 4 Dispatches programme broadcast that same day, Mr. Francis said, and I quote, "I was also asked, the same as all other campaigns, could I find out anything else that could be used to maybe get the public to not have as much sympathy for the Stephen Lawrence campaign as what it truly had? Is there anything that police could possibly use through the media to start maybe tarring that campaign? It means the amount of sympathy that the campaign can generate locally is going to be vastly diminished. They wanted any intelligence that could have smeared the campaign. Yes, there is this general remit." In a live question and answer session on the Guardian website on the 23rd of June of 2013, Mr. Francis confirmed that similar practices had been adopted in respect of other justice campaigns. Gathering intelligence secretly about campaigns, he said, and then using that to potentially undermine them are separated by a very thin line. Had I found out anything detrimental and newsworthy about the Lawrence family, the police using the media then would have used that information to smear the family. My superiors were after any intelligence of that order, and that was made very clear to me. But I would just like to clarify, the Lawrences were not unique in this. The same went for other justice campaigns that I have already said I infiltrated. Despite this evidence, Operation Hearn concluded that SDS reporting on Black justice campaigns had been collateral intrusion, occurring when potentially violent groups targeted by the SDS had aligned themselves with justice campaigns. It found, I quote, "no evidence of covert operations targeted against any of the respective families or justice campaigns." The July 2014 Hearn report stressed that, and again I quote, "the SDS and the covert operatives did not directly target such campaigns, but became exposed to them as a result of the activities of the groups that they had infiltrated." However, these conclusions, based on an absence of records evidencing direct targeting, make no reference to Hearn's findings in its March 2014 report that prior to the introduction of the National Intelligence Model in about 2014, there was little, and again I quote, "directed tasking and requests were informal and ad hoc, and differed to current practices. Indeed, direct tasking was avoided on the grounds that it could compromise an operation. And again, I quote, officers were provided with limited instruction and in effect left to make individual choices while operationally deployed. This point was made by Marc Ellison in his report following his review of Peter Francis's allegations. I quote, in light of the limited records available, little weight can be attached to the absence of a record confirming an assertion made by an officer as being indicative of whether or not that assertion is correct. Ellison found, in respect of the era that he was examining, in the 1992 to 1995 era, he said, specific operational tasking was usually communicated orally by an undercover officer's detective inspector. Peter Francis appears to have told Ellison that he largely received his instructions through his detective chief inspector N86 on the drive to work. It's also a matter of common sense that if undercover officers were being asked to be on the lookout for information that could be used to tarnish family justice campaigns, it's unlikely that they would have recorded any of that on the face of police records. In other words, given the context, an absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. All of this serves to underline the importance of the inquiry looking beyond the face of such police documents as it is now able to retrieve and inquiring carefully into the surrounding circumstances when making assessments about the true or one of the true motivations for the targeting of justice campaigns. And a critical part of that is listening to those like Mr. Burke-Monerville, the de Menezes family, and Mr. Wadsworth, who were part of the campaigns. Mr. Burke-Monerville, Ms. Armani de Silva, and Mr. Wadsworth share the concerns expressed by all of the non-state core participants in relation to the inquiry's ability to get to the truth of the circumstances, to get to the truth in circumstances where it has largely excluded non-state individuals from effective participation by restricting cover names, by compartmentalizing non-state core participants into narrow categories of direct interest determined by the inquiry, and by holding at least the initial hearings in circumstances where only a tiny number of non-state core participants and members of the public will be able to see and hear the evidence. They also endorse everything said by Mr. Ryder in his opening statement about spying on justice campaigns. And like the other non-state core participants you've already heard from, my clients also wish to address the inquiry's lack of expertise and experience in relation to racism and the risk that this presents to the inquiry being able to get to the truth. This is a critical issue for them and for all those who were spied on as part of justice campaigns. As mentioned already, Mr. Burke-Monerville and Miss Armani de Silva were both claimants in the judicial review of the then Home Secretary's refusal to appoint a diverse panel to sit with you, sir, to assist with this investigation. And the issue is of such great importance to the prospect of the inquiry getting to the truth that the remainder of this opening statement is devoted to addressing it. There can be few people nowadays, including in the field of dispensing justice, who have not heard the term unconscious bias. It has become common currency because of the compelling nature of an ever-increasing body of scientific research conducted over the last several decades in the field of the mind sciences, especially the field of implicit social cognition. And this research has led to an appreciation and an understanding of the nature and processes of human perception, judgment, and decision-making, which have debunked notions of objectivity. It's shown instead the existence and force of unconscious biases that drive how we frame our perceptions, how we make judgments, and how and what we decide. These are biases because they refer to a systematic error in the thinking process. They're often connected to a heuristic, a mental shortcut, and are deployed subconsciously to make inferences and judgments. And this has been shown to be as true of legal decision-making as any other field of human endeavour, and to impact upon a judge's fact-finding role. Many different types of biases have been identified, but some are of particular importance in relation to the issues of racial, and I say in parentheses, I add in parentheses, sexual inequality and political policing, all of which are central to this inquiry. Of particular significance is what's known as in-group bias, which leads us to shift standards in a direction that shields those with whom the decision maker identifies, the in-group. And there is a move to shield that in-group from ethical responsibility. In other words, we unfairly favour somebody from our own group. An in-group bias is itself informed by the wider social and cultural forces at play, forces which even from birth develop and shape internal processes by which we make decisions. Thus, while empathy has been shown by behavioural psychologists to be innate in babies as young as 3 months old, they've also demonstrated how empathy narrows as a child grows and layers of identity start to develop, those layers shaped by outside forces. And as that happens, the child becomes more selective, and his or her empathy, based on whom they identify with most, narrows to the extent that they seek the punishment of those who don't share their identity. In other words, empathy narrows in favour of the in-group, which is itself identified by the dominant external forces. So where, therefore, society is structured according to a hierarchy of racism and prejudice, as ours unquestionably has been for centuries, this strong external force will, from birth, influence and shape a person's attitudes and behaviour, both consciously and unconsciously. And the young age at which this interplay between external factors and subjective processes influences human beings and its potentially perverse effects can be seen in the work of African-American psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark. As far back as the 1940s, they demonstrated that both black and white school children attributed positive qualities to white dolls and negative qualities to black dolls in their groundbreaking doll test, demonstrating bias in young children. And the poignant conclusion to the recordings was the realization by black children that they too must be ugly or bad because they look like the black doll. Another relevant bias is fundamental attribution error. And this is an error in our attempts to explain the causes of a person's behavior by attributing it to internal, enduring traits such as personality and ignoring situational factors. Coupled with the way in which our attribution of personal characteristics is itself already subject to, for example, racial or cultural bias or stereotyping, the error becomes compounded. And then there is the backfire effect, according to which our beliefs become strengthened in the face of challenge. The French psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, in his seminal book, Black Skin, White Masks, spoke of it as the tendency to rationalize one's observations to fit with one's pre-existing beliefs. Sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong, and when they're presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence can't be accepted. It will create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief. This inquiry is tasked with focusing on human behaviour, the behaviour of officers, the behaviour of those they spied upon. All of these biases and others are bound to impact upon the assessment of what happened and why it happened. But what is more, Given your background and life experiences, sir, the in-group is obviously the establishment, in this instance, the police, tasked with protecting law and order. The non-state core participants represent the outgroup in multiple ways: the race of the family justice campaigns, the sex of the women who were deceived into intimate relationships, and the politics of the campaigning groups. The potential impact of unconscious bias is manifold. And this isn't a theoretical concern. You have steadfastly failed to recognise the risk of unconscious bias. At a meeting with non-state core participants, including Mr. Burke-Monerville, on the 12th of December of 2018, you were challenged by the core participants on your understanding of institutional sexism. You acknowledged a wish to be informed about this, but then you immediately rejected the suggestion that you might be assisted by a panel during the investigative stage of the inquiry, responding, "If the Home Secretary accepts my requests for a panel at the lessons learned stage, including institutional sexism, I will have a panel. As far as what happened, I have the approach of a historian to look at the evidence and reach conclusions about what happened." But that illustrates precisely a lack of awareness of how your background and life experiences shape the way you see the world. It suggests a belief that the fact-finding stage of the inquiry can and will be an objective process, unaffected by your own worldview, including the unconscious biases which animate it. Mr. Wadsworth, himself a historian, whose latest book is Comrade Sak Shapurji Saklajvala MP, a political biography, and who has recently produced the BBC television documentary Fighting for King and Empire, Britain's Caribbean Heroes, has grave concerns about this view of historical analysis as an objective process taking place from an Archimedean point, uninfected by the same cognitive distortions as affect the population in general, not shaped by the culture and society in which the historian was raised. He would highlight, for instance, the radically different perspectives on imperialism taken by academics such as David Starkey and Niall Ferguson on the one hand, and William Dalrymple, David Olusoga, and Mr. Wadsworth himself on the other. As the numerous studies referred to in the UCLA Law Review demonstrate, confidence in one's own objectivity is the most dangerous attitude to have, because it is a fact, if a fact finder is unaware of how her own subconscious biases affect her perceptions of the facts, then she can't address them. I quote, "Most judges view themselves as objective and especially talented at fair decision-making. For instance, Rachlinsky et al. Found in one survey that 97% of judges, that was 35 out of 36, believed that they were in the top quartile in avoiding racial prejudice in decision-making relative to other judges attending the same conference. That is obviously mathematically impossible. Unfortunately, there is evidence that believing ourselves to be objective puts us at particular risk for behaving in ways that belie our self-conception," end quote. Some of the key issues in this inquiry are the extent to which racism and sexism, conscious, unconscious, individual, and institutional, shaped the misuse of undercover policing. Another important issue is to examine the justification for under-policing operations, which targeted political groups, including those which were not violent, but were simply viewed by the state as unpopular or subversive. Mr. Burke-Monerville, Ms. Armani de Silva, and Mr. Wadsworth are concerned that your approach to date, sir, not only manifests a lack of self-awareness of your own subconscious biases, but a corresponding lack of understanding of these issues. For example, when you met Mr. Burke-Monerville on the 29th of April of 2019, you repeatedly made observations that suggest you broadly accept the police narrative that justice campaigns were collateral intrusion. You said, inevitably, the target of the reporting was not the main campaign, but the groups in the campaigning. And when asked whether Special Branch could have been involved in the filming of the Justice for Trevor campaign by police, and whether this was linked to the police harassment of the family, you responded, "I doubt that they would. They were seeking those creating greater harm." As far as Mr. Burke-Monerville is aware, you had not, by that time, studied the documents relating to his case in any depth. But in any event, you certainly hadn't received any evidence from him or anyone involved in the campaign. And in that context, it's concerning that you are starting from the assumption that the campaign was not deliberately targeted, one of the key issues that you're tasked with investigating. At the previous meeting on the 12th of December of 2018, you also made a comment which, whilst very well-meaning and sympathetic, indicates a fundamental lack of insight into the issue of structural racism. Mr. Burke-Monerville explained to you why he considers it important that you have assistance with understanding racism. And he said, I quote, "It's painful for me to read about my own children being killed. I read that you don't need a panel to help you understand racism properly, but you do not know much about racism. I get nervous talking about my children. It's not easy to get up every day and to know that you've lost two sons, and it must be remembered that this was before his third son was tragically killed." I continue with the quote, "You lose one, you think you might cope, and then it happens again. I hope you understand what I mean. I've read some of the comments that you made about racism, and I think you need additional people to look at the evidence with you and to help you make decisions, especially relating to racism. I'd like to know why you think you can do this without help when you've no experience of racism, no discrimination training." And you subsequently responded, likening Mr. Burke-Monerville's experience to loss during war. And you said this, "No one can hear what you said without having respect and sympathy. The only comparable thing I can bring to mind is loss in war. I've seen in the French countryside names of 2 or 3 brothers appear together. A ghastly catastrophe. Your loss is at least as bad. I will do my level best to tell you what happened." And as Mr. Burke-Monerville pointed out in response, whilst well-meaning, the analogy with wartime loss missed such a critical aspect of Mr. Burke-Monerville's loss that it didn't occur in conditions of war, but on the streets of London, where he and his family ought to be able to expect a reasonable level of protection, and police investigations capable of identifying suspects and bringing them to trial. But he doesn't have that because of the colour of his skin. Mr. Burke-Monerville responded, "I mentioned lost in war to make you realise that we are not at war now, so why should I suffer that loss? I'm aware that most things I encounter on the streets come from people not caring. Not enough care in the world for people of my colour." We give further examples in our written opening. It's positive that you, sir, have undertaken some diversity training since these meetings took place. However, Mr. Burke-Monerville, Ms. Armani de Silva and Mr. Wadsworth are far from reassured that it is enough to enable you to begin, from at best a standing start, to interrogate fairly and with a truly open mind the intensely complex issues that arise around institutional racism, sexism, and other forms of implicit and structural bias that are, or ought to be, at the heart of this inquiry. As the UCLA research made clear, it is vital that legal decision makers, including judges, are aware of and reflect on their own implicit and unconscious biases. Ridding ourselves of such biases is exceptionally difficult, which is why the non-state core participants have repeatedly argued for a diverse panel at the fact-finding stage to redress the imbalance by providing a diversity of expertise and lived experience. Unsurprisingly, no doubt because of its neutralising effect on the impact of cognitive biases, diversity has been shown repeatedly to lead to better decision-making. A range of perspectives ensures that the biases, conscious and unconscious, of each decision-maker are more likely to be challenged and examined. Finally, it is important to consider how the potential for unconscious bias to go unchallenged will be magnified in this inquiry, because so much of the police evidence will be heard behind closed doors, untested and unobserved by those who would be able to bring a different perspective. And for all those reasons, Mr. Burke-Monerville, Ms. Armani de Silva and Mr. Wadsworth wish formally to record that they hold out little hope for this inquiry's ability to get to the truth. So those are the submissions I wanted to make on behalf of my clients.